Greetings, everyone. My name is Kairo Seijuro, and I've come to you again with a with another remarkable yet astounding revelation I've come to in the interesting manner that epiphanies tend to occur, and that is I pretty much dubbed it the universe in my breakfast. So that will be the name of this tab for now. For example, excuse me. Well, basically I started coming to the conclusion of universal evaluation, particularly with that of the birth of the solar system, or any part of the universe. Let's basically take a step back on the evaluations of both a lot of different theories, particularly of the what was it, the drop of the sun or drop of Earth or whatever, which personally I think is completely over-expanding the principle of what I'm about to explain. But it did kind of give rise to the idea of evaluating planetary development in a solar system or any planetary system surrounding a star. Now, what I came to realize, this also applies to to a great number of other formulas and theories that have been presented up to date. But let me go into a detail about how and what I'm talking about. Firstly, planetary development, I cannot see a cluster of planets, any cluster of planets, or any one planet, becoming the way they are based off of a single sense of diversity. On a geophysical reaction point, it's hard to conceive the idea that we're a bunch of rocks coming together would form a vast diversity of multiple types of planets, especially with multiple atmospheric differences and densities. I don't see that one formula resulting in multiple reactions or multiple results. I just don't see that. I see that as practically insane. So here is my take, and this is where I kind of come into place of this, because I was boiling a pot of water on my stove, getting ready to make my breakfast, just simple spiced noodles, very, very filling, but not high, just high calorie, but at the same time not too filling, very energetic. It's just something good to snack on. It's cheap and you can add flavoring, but that's aside the point. It's definitely not ramen noodles though. But what I came to realize is the nature of boiling water. Well, if you look at the sun in its early, let's say prehistory, it would be both massive and extremely unstable. And by extremely unstable, I mean it has more mass by volume than both its gravitational field and its atmosphere can manage. So what happens, and where I basically came to this conclusion, is under the nature of boiling water with a lid, hence, the atmosphere and by volume. Well, if you put a lot of water, let's say, to the brim of the pot, and you cover it up with no real releases, no holes representing the general fabric of space, it's basically pushing against it and pulling against it at the same time. So it's this nice equilibrium of mass by control. And it creates a remarkable, Goldilocks zone of gravitational and bigravitational pull. Bigravitational is the term I'm using for the opposite of gravitational pull, which would pull inward rather than outward. So people refer to it as a vacuum, but I see it as something a little more fundamental than that, because there's plenty of stuff in space. It's not void. It's definitely got a lot of micro magnetic particles that collectively react in the same manner. But that being said, I looked at the pot of water, and it, when you put too much water in it and you have it on max it can go, which would represent the peak of energy output, well, what happens? The water starts boiling and it starts breaking surface. It starts basically spattering everywhere, and it starts to escape the general trajectory of the centerfold of where the water's boiling. Our sun is a standalone, even though our system's a binary system, it is standalone in terms of its own manufacturing of multiple elements, particles, and energies, not to mention vast many other things. But that being said, when it's boiling over, water will eject, if not large portions of water, bits of water at a time. And this is to regulate the volume by energy production, by atmospheric pressurization, this catalyst of three elements or three systems that are not stable. And these three systems will have to stabilize to a point where the water will boil until it doesn't have the energy is still there, but the resources being recirculated are not bypassing the mass by volume, and have basically reached a point where they're no longer being ejected from the system. Now, our sun had to have functioned at one particular time in a very, if not identical way. But these ejections would range from extremely, well, I mean, in the beginning I would imagine that they were, repeatedly large. So, and just like solar flare ejections, this was probably a manner of which the ejection occurred. In fact, I could only imagine it being so because electromagnetic discharge of that particular magnitude could also eject and carry mass, basically a giant bubble, so to speak, that when it explodes releases from the atmospheric conditions, because and it's funny because the power of this kind of release contradicts the gravitational field of the sun itself, or is completely immune to it. But the point is that these ejections could have helped not only reduce the volume of the star, sun, soul, whatever you want to call it, in order to progressively stabilize the energy output in comparison to its mass and its atmospheric gravitational catalyst, or I should say casing, excuse me. And during this process of this, this had to have been, maybe a billion or so years in and of itself, a few billion years perhaps, multiple ejections occurred. Not just once and not just in one way, but during specific chapters of the star's life, it would eject, for lack of a better phrase, its own form of waste. And people's bodies function in the same manner, where they create substances that are not indigenous to it. Therefore, they eject it in the form of waste, ranging from sweat to tears to excrement to urine, you name it. All of these substances are byproducts of the catalysts going on in the body, and the star, our sun, is really not that much different. if not originally, this factor occurs within the suns or within stars. And that, now that I brought that to the table, I want to go over the variable discharges going from A to Z, or not A to Z, but from, let's say, from Mercury to Pluto. Okay, let's start with Mercury. Mercury would actually be the most recent ejection, as all the planets have progressively become smaller and smaller and smaller. Pluto being the technical exception, probably the sudden start of these kinds of ejections. Okay? Now, if you're going to follow me, please bear in mind you have to keep an open mind when it comes to this, and you have to forgive my partially eccentric way of talking about this, because I'm kind of ecstatic about thinking about this, so if you will follow me. Each planet, starting with Mercury, being the latest ejection of the Sun, has a unique composition. So it only ejected what the star itself didn't need. Also, the mass is not just gases and electronically charged particles. No, we're talking whole bits of the Sun, like the body exuding a cyst or something like that. An entire foreign substance ejected from the body. The star would eject a centered bit of elements that had accumulated together because they were nowhere else in the star, and the star would eject these substances, whatever they may be, from concentrated helium, whatever. Each planet has its own unique composition for that reason. Mercury, having lots of unique characteristics, would be the last of the, okay, maybe I should start with Pluto. Okay, let's start with Pluto. Pluto being the catalyst of the beginning first phase, where the pressure is building up and the first ejection comes out. And then you have Neptune. No, I'm sorry, Uranus. Uranus being its own configuration and unique elements, as well as helium, and ammonia, not to mention the ammonia. I'm not going to go over the entire element composition of each planet, although I should have pulled up some charts so that I can present this in a more practical manner, but I'll go over that some other time. I'm sure you could do the research yourself and really step forward on it, because personally I'm not interested in taking credit for something like this. I just want to see it come to light to other people, coherently. Okay, starting back from Uranus and Neptune, and you have Saturn, and you have Jupiter, and then Saturn. All of these occurred under unique configurations of ejections, and ironically enough, because the way they were shifted outward, when they're charged slightly opposite of the Sun's polarity, they will only go out as far. Mind you, this is where magnetism comes into extremely important by step-by-step ejection, because when you have a certain composition by mass of magnetic resilience, it's going to push away only that distance to the optimal distance, and then it's just going to sit there in the neutral zone, because after that it would be a matter of pulling rather than pushing away. And when it comes to Pluto being that far out, it makes you wonder if its magnetic characteristics in the opposing manner may actually not necessarily be super opposing to the sun, but rather piggybacking on the resilience of the other planets in front of it that have come after it. But anyway, because that's the only way it explains why it would go out that far, because if you stack a bunch of negative magnets back to back, but they're all facing each other, pushing away, and double back negative magnets are kind of rare, but I'm sure they could be made. But that's beside the point. The point is that each planet has been basically ejected from mass, ejected from our star in a specific order. Our dwarf Nemesis star was probably one of the first to be ejected. Because of the nature of our system, our star probably was faced in a slightly different direction during that time, and then once it got to off this tilt, it started ejecting more because the tilt was more centered and not so inconsistent when it came to an angle, a downward diagonal angle on an ovular path. But when it comes to a circular path, there's more energy and it's more focused, it's more centered. So during the RPMs, the energy dispersion is a lot higher, which would also explain why all the planets are even. They're all on the same level. They're all on the same lateral flight path. Or call it the equator line, the equatorial rotations, But that being said, that would also explain why Uranus, unlike the rest of the planets, even Saturn and Uranus, their rings are not parallel or not aligned to the orbital transit. Now, I don't think, as far as Saturn is concerned, I think that maybe it just eventually stabilized and created its own magnetic polarity to match its trajectory. But when it comes to Uranus, Uranus's angle of the rings would suggest that the sun itself had been at a different angle. And this is probably right after or shortly after the ejection of Nemesis trajectory, because the angle of Uranus is probably the most ironic as far as it tilting at an angle. It's almost completely vertical. Well, it makes you wonder. During that channel where Nemesis is ejected, like say maybe a billion years later, or half a billion years, about 580, maybe 600 million years later, during that shift, or maybe even sooner, I don't know. All I know is the pattern is unmistakable. When Nemesis was ejected and it started creating, its own ejections / planets, it was unstable. And it was being thrown out of the system because of, the angle that it took. Because when the sun shifted, its trajectory didn't change, but the sun kept ejecting other things. Now, when that happened, after Pluto, and it ejects one more time, and then it's a massive ejection, because, comparison to Pluto versus Uranus is a big difference. The angle must have been, very pulled down by Nemesis's path, because that's a larger volume, not quite as big as Jupiter, but definitely as big as big enough to create enough magnetic pull, especially if it's a high concentration of hypermagnesium or something like that, something that would create an extremely high magnetic gravitational pull, which would also explain why it has such an effect on our sun, because it's the first, the first turd that our planet, our sun, shot out. But that being said, and mind you, this is basically a form of fissioning. So this is a real thing. This is a real anatomic occurrence when it comes to catalytic splitting. And so think of it on terms of nuclear physics when you're talking about planetary fission. So planetary fission, or star fission, would occur in this kind of concept. But I think this was like 1 to 2 at a time. 2 is very rare. So naturally, probably was, one big fission or two, or a few progressively smaller fissions. But okay, going back to point. When you have this trajectory line pulling down, so for a brief period probably being a few million, or maybe shy of a few 100,000 or maybe a million years, because this was relatively fast. The alignment pulled the poles of the sun progressively, not really fast, but progressively, to a vertical position, or a near vertical position, which at that time was creating substantial irregularities in the sun, ejecting Neptune, and eventually Neptune stabilized and became mostly gas, because probably the contents of that particular planet probably held in tandem with the particular magnetic pull more than most. So it only ejected that particular elements, those sets of elements in those volumes, to stabilize the sun again. And then you have, Saturn, or not Saturn, Neptune. Okay, Neptune stabilized because, and if you look at the rings are basically on the return path. They're basically where the sun came back to its normal rotation, or its normal axis, during the farthest point of Nemesis' return, or of Nemesis' departure. So basically the farthest away you could possibly get. And I don't know, maybe this happened a good number of times before it occurred. When it would go, after a number of passes, or maybe a few passes, or maybe even one pass, the planet was able to mostly become even. And the equatorial line, representing the area of the most concentrated magnetic pull and effect, basically basically where the equatorial line is. I'm getting a little redundant here, and I apologize. I'm formulating this in my head the way I was thinking about it before. But basically, this chain reaction over time was not just one chain reaction, but multiple occurrences occurring under the same conditions. But basically, Jupiter being the next in line, or sorry, Saturn basically did the same thing. A slightly different angle because it was slightly raised, but Saturn is a little more even than the others. I'm sorry, I'm looking at a couple of diagrams here. I'm not going to pull them up because I'm just recording this on the things. Okay, yeah, that looks about right. And when it came to this kind of transition, this reaction and then reaction, it's amazing how this occurred, because this was a churning process. Nemesis is acting as a churning system after the fact. The first ejection, that star is creating the same occurrence. It's radical, and it carried on in a different manner. But when it comes to Sol, these ejections are remarkably sound, and yet they make sense, because when something's spinning and boiling at the same time, it's going to spin and stabilize, and this is, of course, each one representing a different degree of RPMs and boiling point, not to mention energy production, and various is a variable in volume by mass by by atmosphere. Again, this is one of those things where they all start as a hot core. They all have a stupid hot core. However, each one's chemical composition, materials, minerals, and various gases, were all by volume different, and therefore isolatively developed differently. And when it comes to Jupiter must have been I don't think Jupiter actually was always that big. I think Jupiter started out extremely unstable, but low mass, or low density. Basically, it's whatever was ejected was highly volatile, but not that big. And so anything that collected or produced would burn up in its own atmosphere, and it still does this today, because its energy storms are extremely powerful, but its mass is really, or its density is really low. So the fact that it became a gas giant, it burned away all those all the primary density, but became stable in terms of volume by mass when it came to its atmospheric pressure. So it regulated itself. It basically became functional. And that also explains, again, why even with the power storms they have, or that superstorm, the Jupiter's classic eye, that is acting again as another churning point. Now, a friend of mine made a joke about this one time, saying that the eye of the storm had two purposes. One, to spot the current trajectory, or the current location of the surroundings of the nearby star, which it's a nice idea, but I don't think that's true. The second was to track the binary star, Nemesis. Not necessarily the angle trajectory, but the direction. The general direction by radius. So you point on a radar one direction, it might be down or up, but it would be in that direction. Which was a very interesting thought, because that might actually be true, though again, unless it's actually put to the test, I don't think it would be very substantial. But it is something to think about. It is a possibility. And if someone proves it wrong, then it's wrong. I'm just saying, this is the kind of outside-the-box thinking when it came to universal development. And how many links are, how many cogs in this gearworks are turning not at one angle, but at multiple angles. And anyway, moving forward, this catalyst of development goes all the way back, all the way to Mercury, and Mercury is one of the smallest planets in our system to Pluto, because the Sun has finally reached its stability point, where unless it creates a lot more of whatever needs to be ejected, there won't be another ejection for a really long time. But on the other hand, this would also explain the digression between a star that grows, gets bigger, gets too big, starts ejecting masses, and then eventually can lead to a supernova, where so much of its mass has been ejected that it eventually goes critical and starts destabilizing because it can't sustain itself, and then implodes, and so on and so forth. Which is why this principle, I think, also applies to the Big Bang Theory. But here's where the difference lies. The Big Bang didn't occur in an instant. That is where I'm going to say it's wrong, because the nature of this ejection system is the same thing on a universal scale all over the place, and it is universally applicable everywhere, not just in the planets themselves and the solar system and various other systems and galaxies. It's also applicable. This is also systematic ejection on almost any form of life on the planet, including the nature of cellular mitosis. When as soon as I say that, if you know what that is, then you know the nature of molecular fissioning, and then you can connect the dots. But as far as the Big Bang is concerned, I don't think that it happened in an instant. I think it happened relative, like say if it were the ultimate star and it had so much instability, it was so unstable, so unbelievably energetically violent, that it started ejecting not in one direction, but in many directions for long periods of time, and not just in set intervals. I mean, we're talking rapid ejections from a single source. Now, I can't look at it as an explosion, because in space there is no explosion. There can't be. But there can be fissioning. And cellular mitosis in the water occurs all the time. Cellular mitosis, or molecular fissioning of molecules and atoms in a set space, happens a lot. For example, and this is an internal feature, okay? Sword cuts through a baseball or any other ball, and the ball splits into two. Well, what happens when if the ball doesn't split all the way? If it just cuts only like maybe halfway or third way through, well, it's split, and it becomes unstable, but it's still in one piece. So it's not a complete fission, and therefore it cancels itself out. You can only repeat this process from stage 1. You can't start from stage 2. It will destabilize and it will no longer be useful. This is the same principle that I'm going to apply when it comes to the manner that ejection in a void space that would apply to the Big Bang Theory in regards to this factor. There was not an explosion, but rather a progressive, multiple, rapid fissioning of a single source. And multiple rapid fissioning, this isn't going in one direction. This is going in every possible direction imaginable, or wherever it just happens to go, So imagine, and this is just going into the manner of which this could be applied to conceive how this works. When the ejection is so big, or I should say so repetitive, I would call it the progressive dehydration of the universe. Let's look at it that way. Okay, when so much water or whatever element is being ejected at a rapid pace, if you started crying, crapping your pants, pissing yourself, or and sweating profusely, you're bleeding, or from somewhere, it doesn't matter where, whether it's a cut or a menstrual cycle, it doesn't matter. This process, if you were to do this for any amount of time longer than, let's say, measurement between 10 billion years and a day, and a single, and like say 1 minute, or trillions of years, like say 1 minute to a trillion years, you would be extremely exhausted. Your mass couldn't handle that. Well, imagine if this was necessary for you to live, or you to survive, or in other words, you've become so unstable that you cannot maintain yourself as an existence without doing this, because everything else is violating your current standing of being. And the nature of multiple mass fissioning like this is, and then the principle I was going to use for this was, you take a bucket of water, okay, or a 5-gallon barrel, you punch it full of holes, little holes, not something too too big, or maybe holes towards the top, but these are tiny holes, like pin type holes, okay. Then you put that barrel, like say like 100, maybe 1,000 holes, okay, 1,000 holes towards the top, like say the top last 25%, the top 25% of the barrel, full of water. Not quite big enough for the water to escape, but big enough to where it would escape under pressure, aka energy, instability. Then you put that barrel, anchor that barrel to a rotating disc or some kind of platform that would operate and spin at a high RPM, very high RPM, high as you could possibly, conceive. Like say 10,000, maybe 50,000, maybe 150,000 RPMs a minute. Okay, that is a lot, but that's the kind of, not even anywhere near close. But you have to think about that versus, I don't know, 10 million maybe. 10 to the 100,000th power or something like that. There's any greater magnitude is only emphasis of how this works fundamentally. All right. Well, anyway, barrel spinning at 150,000 RPMs, anchored, not moving. It is perfectly even in its center of mass. Its axis is completely unmanipulated. However, the catalytic contents of that object or spatial matter is so unbelievably stable that it finds a way to escape. And eventually, and this is where it gets interesting, this is going to cause the pressure on the inside to push and pull at the same time. That water is going to escape and spatter everywhere. Everywhere. It's going to spatter everywhere. It's going to look like a sprinkler is going off. And this stuff is going to fly everywhere. Water is going to go everywhere. Well, this is the same principle behind the nature of the actual Big Bang, which is not really an explosion so much as it was a massive fissioning. A massive fissioning of inconceivable, chaotic fissioning of such an unbelievable degree. But that being said, it goes all the way back, and it still supports the idea. The only difference is how it goes about doing that. And I'm sure Stephen Hawking would love to get his hands on something like this, and he probably would. Maybe he already conceived it that way. I don't know. I've never talked to him in person, and I've sure as hell never seen him or heard him explain it in this manner in any of his presentations. And I have watched a good few of them, and it just didn't make any sense. Or, I mean, it made sense from a certain standpoint, but not fundamentally. But if he does agree with this, then that makes me feel better. But my point is that this fissioning process doesn't just apply to molecular processes. It applies to mass molecular processes as well. And unfortunately, I don't really think that the only difference between this and the drop of Earth, where I guess some kind of progenitor would have hit the planet during its early phase and was soft enough to, or the planet was soft enough to absorb it, but by mass by volume. See, the problem with this theory is that it doesn't apply to this is for two reasons. One, it's opposite fissioning, and it's going to eat it. Well, if the theory were true, it would eat it, not eject another fission. Because the core doesn't make any sense. Where does that object come from? That has to start from somewhere else. So instead of trying to do this in terms of fissioning in that place, why don't we look at this term in fissioning of the factor that that Earth may have fissioned at one point during its early history, creating the moon. But since the moon was such a small volume of heated mass instead of just elements, it cooled off and became basically a floating satellite rather than a planet slash star. You know, we're talking down the grains of sand, where the grains are just too fine to really consider as grains, so they get progressively smaller. You can only cut a diamond so many times before it becomes dust. Well, the same concept applies here. And you know, and with drop of Earth, it's the opposite. It's actually a progenitor interjecting to the planet and creating the moon, which doesn't make any sense, because that progenitor has to come from somewhere. That's like saying, oh, that baseball that got hit just happens to come from somewhere else, hits the planet in its prototypic stage, which, by the way, is extremely unstable and not actually properly forged together. So if it were to hit that, all it would do is do the same thing it would do if it hit Jupiter now. It would pass right through it and create a mass hole. It wouldn't stop. It wouldn't stop at all, especially if it were be the high density that it would be proclaiming in the theory. So that doesn't make any sense. You know, you shoot a shotgun barrel, or you shoot a shotgun loaded with a 29 millimeter, 29 or maybe 59 gram or 59 millimeter bearing, or 59 grams, or whatever. I remember seeing a video on that. I don't remember exactly the measurement, but I'm pretty sure it's 29 millimeters or bigger, out of a shotgun shell, and it tore right through a ballistic shell. It tore right through it. It did not stop. High density versus high mass. You know, that it didn't stop. It went right through it. It didn't stop inside it. And the same concept applies here. It wouldn't have stopped. It would have kept going. Because at that stage, the Earth wasn't as physically tough as it was before. Sure, it was energetically, you know, unbelievably unstable, but it was not physically sound yet. And at that point, there was no way for that to have achieved critical mass in that term. So, drop of Earth is a total bullshit story. Not a bad idea, but it's the wrong conditions for that to occur. However, it could definitely have fissioned on its own excrement, so to speak. You know, because it's still spinning, it's unstable, it's doing the same thing that all the other stars and sun did during that process, but it ejected in its early stage. So that's why it only did it once. Why a lot of the other planets have multiple moons is because they ejected multiple times during the course of their stability, you know, their path to stability. Earth only had to stabilize once. Mercury is the recent of all those, and Mercury and Mars are both stability points. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised, although this is kind of pushing it a little bit, but if Mars stabilized not from the sun, but rather from Earth at one particular time, but did not stabilize completely. You know, and again, this is the one part where I think I'm pushing it a little bit, because I'm kind of letting my creativity get the best of me. But it's a thought, where Mars actually would be a byproduct of Earth's early development, where naturally this is a big ejection. However, because due to the order of this occurrence, this is not likely, because Mars is, you know, I don't know. As far as Mars is concerned, it may have been an ejection from Earth. But that would also mean that Mars came before, Mars definitely came before Earth, clearly. So it's probably not out of the realm of possibility. It could have definitely have come before Earth, because Earth is definitely a new ejection compared to Mars. So, all right, well, I'll set that part aside for now. But this is going back all the way to Mercury. Mercury being the last ejection from, like, say 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 billion years ago, maybe more. And just a little bit more, like maybe 7 to 12 million years, or 12 billion years. This is just going in the terms of this massive progression going on. But the whole point is that this concept is not unplausible. I mean, I've gone over this already hundreds, if not nearly 1,000 times in my head, and it's just too universally applicable. It applies to all the current theories, with the exception of 1 or 2. It applies on a current modern universal scale, dating all the way back to the presumed Big Bang. But the nature of the Big Bang in this regard couldn't have been spontaneous. It had to have been rapid, multiple, massive, progressive fissioning over the course of whatever, its mass by volume could possibly support. But the point is that this catalyst, this occurrence didn't just occur with the Big Bang. It kept repeating this action among all of the other ejections. So this can't have been one giant super hyper dense thing. No, this was probably a massive, super unbelievably stupid, massive object in the void. I mean, we're talking well beyond gigagalactic proportions here. We're talking stupid huge. But it still follows the same procedure as anything that goes before or comes after it. And when I started thinking about that, I thought, holy hell. And, it's when you have things like that connect dots to everything. Not just, one thing, but everything. It doesn't make sense that it would be ignored. I mean, it's not like anybody profits from this, and it's not like it's proving anyone wrong. It's just simply connecting the seams where the stitch lines have always been. Instead of poking new holes, you're just simply connecting the dots where the holes already are. And and this applies to any mass. You cut a piece off, it fissions off. If it's blown up or whatever, it fissions. It's classic shrapnel principle. I'm sure anybody who's worked with explosives long enough would understand the nature of this. Anybody who's worked with, who's a chemist who knows about catalytic reactions on an explosive scale. This is not hard to understand. It's just how unbelievably deep it goes and how diverse yet simple the process is. People can't conceive it that well because the time frame of their conception is a standard of 2 years of interest, and they take interest on it after that based on that. But the point is that the lifespan and life expectancy of average humans is not long enough to coherently understand this without brushing it to the wayside, feeling like it's a waste of time. It's really not hard to understand. In fact, I'm so unbelievably enthralled at the formulas that go back all the way to what would be the Big Bang. The concept of it being called the Big Bang just also doesn't make any sense. It's the right idea, but the wrong formula placed in the right formula placed in the wrong manner, exercised in the wrong way. It's the right direction. It's just not the right system. And it's not an explosion, because in space, an explosion doesn't work that way. You can only have things that fission, because in order to have an explosion, you need two things. You need chemical volatile reaction, and you need pressure that has nowhere to go. Well, in the void, that can go everywhere. That can literally go everywhere. That can literally go everywhere, because everything that's going through the void has almost no obstructions. Now, if you were to surround that water barrel with like, you know, this light mesh, you know, like a door screen, spinning at the high RPM like that, those water droplets are going to rip through that net meshing simply by pure velocity alone. Now, if this were to happen on a massive, you know, all together at once, if you speed that up to like very, very fast, very, you know, super fast, it will look like an explosion, because it's being ripped apart so fast that it looks like it's shredding all over the place. That's how an explosion works. But when it comes to this, there's no explosion, because there's no casing prohibiting the initial release. It's just going to get siphoned out. Or not siphoned out, fissioned out. And that's why I'm so ecstatic about this, because this is universally applicable. And if any, you know, geophysicists, you know, ballistic physicists, or nuclear physicists, particularly in the field of molecular physics, were to probably sit down and listen to this and start doing personal notes and comparisons, I would love to hear what you have to say, because I'm not necessarily not committed to researching this. It's just, to me, this feels like extremely common sense, so I don't really feel the drive to prove a point. But if you do, by all means, I would love to hear people's opinions. And I take that back. I don't want to hear their opinions. I want to hear their personal pursuit on the matter. I want to see what they have uncovered for themselves in regards to this, because opinions are, you know, arguable. They don't match up. Everyone's got one. Their opinion is an outward expression of a self-centered perspective. It is not something that's shared among other people. It can only reach this kind of grain of mutuality and a neutral zone where they're not pushing and not pulling. They reach a Goldilocks zone that doesn't actually make any progress, which is kind of like the state of the U.S. political parties now. They've reached a point where they don't go anywhere. They're not doing anything. They are not pushing and not pulling anymore. They've reached a comfort zone, and they don't want it to change. But that being said, I'm just saying, I want to bring this up. If anybody wants to, you know, evaluate this, do some personal homework on the matter, please, by all means, do. Because I have absolutely no qualms at filling the gaps where more detail can be made. But the general image cannot change. I know this is how it works. I know this is how it began. And I know that on a universal scale, it applies to every goddamn thing in the universe. Every single fucking thing. Every single atom that you could possibly throw at me. Even the spew of garbage that you'll probably put me in digital form about this will hold the same fundamental system. And this is exactly why I want you to try and find this out and really kind of prove it to yourself. Because me, I love hearing about it when it comes from other people. I hate listening to myself talk. I really do. I find it extremely annoying sometimes. But anyway, I think I'm going to bring this to a close. I've pretty much talked my ass out for an hour. And I brought my epiphany to your attention, as well as, you know, got it out before I forgot it, because I do tend to, when I start thinking about these things, I do forget them if I don't put them in some kind of memorable context, something with a, you know, recollection. But something as simple as this would probably be easier to remember, because it, you know, it's a universal reminder. Anyway, this is Kairo Seijuro, and I am going to finish my meal. Take care.